Eli, this is our 100th episode of Design Better. It's a huge milestone.
It's pretty darn cool. We've been doing this for a bit over 7 years now, but when you hit 100 episodes, that feels like pretty significant.
Yeah, well, whether you've been with us for the whole road or you're brand new to the show, thanks for listening. Thanks for supporting our work. It means the world to us.
Yes, we are so very grateful. We wouldn't be here without everybody who listens to the show. If you're a little newer to Design Better, we thought we'd just kind of quickly walk through some of our more favorite episodes. Aaron, you want to start us off?
Yeah, there are a lot of highlights for me. One of the top highlights was talking to John Cleese. I remember that morning at breakfast before we interviewed him, I told my kids that we were going to go interview Nearly Headless Nick because everybody in my family is a big Harry Potter fan. We watched all the movies. And John Cleese, he's an amazing creative person, a creative thinker. We caught him on an island off the coast of Africa, and he was working on a screenplay and just had so many great things to say about the creative process, collaboration, and how to make it more efficient and inclusive.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, I'd been a fan of his since being a kid. My 3 brothers and I probably memorized several of his movies, Monty Python, Life of Brian. And I did finally get to ask him the question, what's the airspeed velocity of a swallow, which he answered right away, which was cool.
Of course. And how about that conversation with David Sedaris?
So that's another one that, I haven't been a fan quite as long, but definitely over 20 years. And just to get a chance to talk to him and have him share some of his insights into his creative process, I think is amazing. I mean, he's somebody who is so sharply observant and funny, and I don't know, I just feel like I could listen to him for hours, no matter what he's talking about.
Yeah, that was a great one. And Ed Catmull, co-founder of Pixar, and someone who's had his hand in so many major things. He collaborated with Steve Jobs longer than anybody else, more than 30 years. And he also worked on Star Wars. He worked with George Lucas for a number of years. He has a storied career and is also an amazing human being.
Yeah, that was a great one. And he got a bit emotional towards the end when you asked him a question. That's worth tuning in just for that part of it.
Yeah, what he was most proud of.
Mm-hmm.
Eileen Fisher, speaking of amazing human beings, she's built an empire. She's built an amazing brand, a clothing brand that's wonderful. And she just had so many great things to say about what it was like building a business, starting in the 80s, some of the things she had to overcome as a woman, and just how thoughtful she approaches the design of her line.
One we have here on our list that fewer people might be familiar with, but I think is worth going back and checking out. Her name is Sarah Seeger. She's an astrophysicist. She works on discovering exoplanets. So these are planets outside our solar system that may potentially harbor life. And just another person who's a pioneer, extremely intelligent, neurodivergent. She has autism, and she spoke to how she collaborates with her colleagues. And this is a very different realm than most of us work in, but I think we could all learn from her. She was great.
And Seth Godin, who never fails to amaze and inspire. That was a wonderful conversation that we had with him. He thinks so deeply about many subjects. And of all the people that we've talked to, I think he has the strongest gift of sight, of just sort of seeing the thing that's in front of us that we're kind of missing, the real truth, the obvious truth, and is able to convey that so succinctly.
Jason Maiden is somebody that folks might not be familiar with, but he has had a really storied career at Nike and starting his own companies. And that's another one where he shares a lot of practical wisdom, but it gets very emotional too when he's talking about his life story.
Yeah, nearly died as a child and made it through, and that changed who he is. Some other amazing folks, OK Go is a band that I love their videos. I love their music. I just think they're such an inspiring and creative group. They can do the impossible, and they are so thoughtful. They build magic into their work.
Yeah. Do yourself a favor, if you haven't listened to that episode, just go first to YouTube and type in OK Go and watch a few of their amazing music videos, because that will give you a sense for what they're capable of. They're wonderful.
So these are just a few of the amazing interviews that are in that back catalog of 100 episodes of Design Better. We hope you'll scroll back in that podcast feed in your podcast app and maybe dig into a few of these from the past, because these are episodes that are evergreen. There's still lessons in there that are as relevant today as the day they were recorded.
Yeah, we've saved something really special here for our 100th episode. This is a live episode, which we did when we were out in New York a few weeks back with Hillary Coe, who's a former design leader at SpaceX. She's now leading design at VAST, building commercial space stations. She has an amazing background. We dive into it in the beginning of the episode here, but it's one not to miss, and we're honored to have it for our 100th episode.
Without further ado, let's jump into episode 100.
When we first learned about Hillary Coe, we weren't entirely sure she was a real person. Currently Chief Design and Marketing Officer for VAST and working on the world's first commercial space station, Hilary was a design leader for SpaceX, creative director for Apple and Google, a certified commercial pilot, astronaut candidate, drag racing record holder, and advocate for young women and men entering STEM fields. Our question is, how can so many talents and accomplishments be wrapped up in a single human being?
Is she real? Well, yes, she's real. She's here with us for a special live recording of Design Better at New York City Design Festival, presented in partnership with Automatic, makers of WordPress, and Word & Co., who have for decades connected inspiring brands and incredible talent. You know, space exploration has transformed from a big government program thing to a global commercial enterprise thing. And as we increase our presence among the stars, well, there's certainly a role for design to play in shaping our experience. Who better to help us understand design in space than our pal, Hillary Coe?
This is Design Better, where we explore creativity at the intersection of design and technology. I'm Eli Woolery.
And I'm Aaron Walter. We want to just take a moment to say thank you to our Design Better premium subscribers whose support makes this work possible. If you'd like to support the show and maybe go deeper into design, just head over to designbetterpodcast.com/subscribe to learn more about the benefits of becoming a premium subscriber. We'll return to the conversation after this quick break. We want to recommend the Say More podcast, where in a special series, Boston Globe columnist Shirley Luang is opening up the conversation about stress and burnout to help listeners feel less alone and inspired to get help. She connects with an array of experts, like Krista Tippett, who tells us how to find meaning and stillness in a modern life. And she shares her own journey to finding silence and moments of peace. And Emily Nagoski on the ways stress lives in the body, the social pressures that make it worse, and how meaningful the quest to releasing stress can be. Plus, Cal Newport on how to be more productive and creative in an overstimulating world. This series uses medical science, social science, and philosophy to answer deep questions about how stress works on our bodies and on our minds. And you'll come away with concrete strategies to work better and live better. Listen to Say More wherever you get podcasts. And now, back to the show.
Hillary Coe, welcome to Design Better.
Hi, happy to be here.
We are very thrilled to have you. So we're going to take it from the very beginning, rewind to Hillary Coe at age, 4, 5, 6. What were you up to? Were you taking things apart? Were you excited about flying an airplane? What was your childhood like?
I was climbing a lot of trees. I was a weird little kid, I'll admit that. But I think most of us creatives were weird little kids. My father was a pilot. He flew planes. My mother forced him to stop flying planes when my brother was born, which was unfortunate. But I definitely have one of my first core memories of watching him take off out of Torrance Airport and just thinking, that is Superman. That's Superman. You can't convince me otherwise. That gentleman is my father and just left the earth into the air. I think it's kind of what all of us as children, we get so fascinated by space. We see these astronauts living in these rocket ships and they're doing it. They're doing the real thing. And it feels so unattainable and wild and inspiring when you're a child. And that was something that I always told myself I wanted to get back to was one day I want to be Superwoman. I want to be that for someone, be it my nieces, be it for myself, be it for girls I meet who are younger than me. It's something that's always driven me personally, but also just, carrying that with you. I think all of us as creatives have that drive, that thing that inspired us as a kid. And I loved being wild and feral. And I love dreaming about things that seemed impossible. And now I get to do it for a job.
It's interesting. Most mere mortals have their interests and hobbies in kind of a separate bucket, and then their work life is in another bucket. But somehow you've managed to combine these two things. You are a commercial pilot. You spend a lot of time in the air. As we mentioned in the intro, you like to drive a fast car. You do a lot of fun, interesting things. If you go check out some of Hillary's videos on YouTube, it's like, hey, I'm just going to go up in this crazy fancy jet with the Thunderbirds, or like jump out of a helicopter with Red Bull. It's wild stuff. So tell us, how did you manage to combine these interests, the things that lit you up as a child and still light you up today with your work?
I always think of it as friction. I remember being in high school, very much a tomboy, kept to myself, didn't know who I was, felt different in every single way, always hung out covered in paint in the sculpture studio and the art studios, and found this car club. There were these guys just taking apart engines, and I've always been a curious person, and especially when someone's doing something interesting or bizarre or hard. And, I felt that friction. I felt like there's no one who looks like me here, but I'm curious about this. Let's dig into this. And I found that throughout everything that I've done, it's catching that part, right? It's like following the rabbit down the hole, right? It's like seeing the rabbit out of the corner of your eye and just going, let's see where this leads. And, you can call that instinct. You can call that, Zen Buddhist, right? You meditate so you can get closer to that part of you. And with artists, I think it's that magic. It's that thing that you chase and you end up spending 14 hours taking apart some guy's 68 Camaro and not knowing how to put it together and hoping somebody in the hangar next to you can help you because you're kind of screwed otherwise. But that's the fun part. And then at the end of the day, you get to go and, race that thing 8.2 seconds, quarter mile at 160 miles an hour. And, you've created something. There's a benefit to it. I know every part here. I know everything about how this thing works. And to create something that is to bring you that kind of excitement, I mean, that to me feels like a thread across everything that I make, whether it's a product at Google, whether it's a spacecraft that somebody's going to be spending time in. How are you bringing together all of these impossible things to make something it's an exhilarating experience at the end of the day? And I've always chased that. That's always been a thread for me.
What was the transition for you between, there's a lot of enthusiasm about like these physical things, planes and cars, and then in the early part of your career, you're focused more on like digital objects, essentially digital design. What caused that shift or that transition or that part of your interest?
I wanted to be a sculpture artist. I probably in another life. And I always tell Peter Russell Clark, who's this amazing Apple person that I get to work with now, about like, God, I should have been a product designer. He's like, Hilary, I think you did fine. Like you're a storyteller. And I always wanted to tell stories through sculpture. And then I started learning about Otis College of Art and Design, which was in Los Angeles, and they were starting their first digital design department. And that's when all these cool visual effects films are coming out. And I'm like, I want to tell stories through this avenue. Maybe I'm building sets. Maybe I'm a director. Maybe, it's like all of us. We don't know what the heck we're going to do. So let's try everything. So I got into the digital world and like how to program, how to do visual effects, motion graphics, how to tell stories through that kind of interactive. And I think it was Flash design at the time, which, has now gone the way of the dodo. But taking it from that, but always carrying with me that sense of physical meets digital. And that's what I love. I mean, I'm sitting here right now with an incredible team of people creating interfaces for mission control and, how you're talking on the ground to astronauts in space who are going to be able to digitally control temperature and lighting that's going to follow their circadian rhythm. And all of this is the intermixing of both digital and physical, which I hope that as we continue on as designers for human experience, that becomes less and less separate. And I love being at that intersection and understanding and being passionate about both.
Let's talk a little bit about that work with space. There is a common critique, which is there are so many problems here on Earth. Why do we invest our time, our wealth, and energy in space? How do you think about that for yourself?
I would like to start that by saying I agree that there's a heck of a lot of problems here on Earth. And I feel like I took an environmental politics class in college, and it was like, I wanted to save the LA River. And then you start getting into the bureaucracy of it and the fact that no corporation wants to help you. Like government agencies, it's full of bureaucracy and there's no clear path. And I just got so freaking depressed about it, And when I first started, I worked at a company called X Prize. Their philosophy is the problems that corporations don't have motivation to solve, governments don't have motivation to solve. Let's put people's money together and create a prize purse where anyone can sit there and say, I've got, a way to suck carbon dioxide out of the air. And their first prize was actually what created Virgin Galactic, right? It was like, how can we make personal travel to space doable to the average person? And I kind of see space as the same thing, where government doesn't want to solve this big bureaucratic problem. Corporations don't. We've got some fancy rich guys who want to spend a lot of money putting stuff in space. But guess what? Everything that we're working on, especially when it comes to human interface design, human experience, these guys are drinking their pee up there. Talk about, you need to have a sustainable, environment. And I think what we don't talk enough about is how much, even in the Apollo and shuttle eras, how much of that technology just happenstance becomes really great solutions for here on Earth. I will stay away from the everything's not mutually exclusive, but it truly is. I mean, we're sitting here talking about how algae can suck carbon dioxide out of the air and also be edible and also protect against radiation. Any of that kind of stuff that's solving the real hard problem in space is absolutely something that you would want to take that technology home and be able to say, let's live more sustainably here at the same time.
Kind of gives you a different look on universal design, right? You're designing a solution that works for all these different scenarios throughout the universe.
Unfortunately, we shouldn't be looking to government or these big corporations. I mean, they want to make money. Corporations want to make money. And I actually feel very proud of the fact that I get to work on something that is very beneficial to life on Earth. And everything you're doing by growing human skin cells to transplant organs, like you can grow that stuff in zero gravity. And we're discovering, and we don't even know half of it, right? And with companies like Vast, who I just joined freaking 2 weeks ago, and just like drinking through the fire hose of their philosophy and what they believe in and their stake in the ground for, let's create artificial gravity or gradients of gravity so we could go after these challenges and say, what are the kind of things that can benefit humanity that space can open for us? And that to me, I mean, what's better than working for some corporation that's trying to make a buck? In my opinion, it's like I'm closer to solving for Earth because I work in space.
If you think about space technology since, let's say, the 1960s when NASA was first getting human space missions off the ground, it's never, at least the history we're told, it's not really about design or the human experience necessarily, other than we want to keep these astronauts alive. We want to keep these missions going. Why do you think in the modern era with SpaceX, there's so much investment in design right now?
I would be remiss if I didn't mention Richard Dane, who is this beautiful man who created the NASA worm logo, which is one of my favorite logos ever. Go worm.
What about the meatball, though?
No,
meatball?
don't talk about the meatball. We brought it back for commercial crew, and I'm just like, my magnum opus. No, but I mean, it's true. Like back in the Apollo days, I mean, there's a lot of movies out there that are really shining a light on how hard that was to do. But when you're in a Cold War with Russia, and so suddenly you get those defense dollars rolling, but it wasn't about creating a presence beyond, I think, making the astronaut Captain America, the superhero, right? That was important. And they were. I mean, truly, being a pilot, understanding what it took to fly. They were quite literally doing everything. Now Dragon is fairly autonomous. It's not to say that, you don't have to learn a bunch of emergency procedures and understand what to do if something goes wrong. But, you can watch those live broadcasts. Those guys are looking at screens. And what that's saying is, and I think one of the brilliant things that SpaceX was able to do and a lot of these other companies are able to do is lower the playing field and really democratize our access to space. Now, that doesn't mean that just anyone with $20 in their pocket is going to be able to go, but I think it's starting to create that reality where even in our lifetime, we can see something very similar to the airlines. And when you're starting to go from, Maslow's pyramid of we're just surviving to, hey, if this thing's fairly autonomous, it doesn't take a lot of training. So now what's next? Now it's like, how do you optimize for living and working and being efficient? And if you're starting to think about things like circadian rhythm and how do you dictate lighting so that the human experience is actually more primed for everything you want to do up there, I think now we've got the creative brief for it, right? It's not about survival. It's not some nuclear submarine or Antarctica. Now you're sitting here going, we've got a canvas to create something that you go up there and you can just get the job done. And you're FaceTiming your family in your custom sleeping quarters. And being able to take that as a creative brief and say, all right, if it's not just survival, there's people that aren't, Chuck Yeager test pilots for the military. How do you do that across the board? And that's where, oh my gosh, the floodgates open where it's everything from food to exercise. Like, can you use VR in a way where you can utilize your hands and it's hands-free though? And it's just so fun as a creative to take this blank canvas and say, what if? And to push it up against the requirements. I mean, there's real requirements. This is by no means an easy atmosphere, quite literally, to design for. But if you meet those requirements, if you can, things can't be flammable, things float around, you can't have crumbs in space. But with those parameters, how do you design something that's truly sustainable and truly a wonderful experience? And then, of course, like we say, bring that back to Earth.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the problem space, pun intended here, of space.
So, it's going to be a lot of that.
I know. It's yeah.
And a company named Vast, trust me.
Hard to avoid. But the problem space with SpaceX, so you worked on Starlink, which has a very different set of design problems. Design for Dragon Crew, a different set of problems. And now what you're describing is Vast. So there's the temporary moment of space that we're sort of launching and telling a story, getting people excited. There's the kind of functional part of the moments in space, but then there's the long-term, you're describing being in space for a long time. Talk to us about how you think about those different scenarios as a designer.
Yeah, and also as a communicator. There was a brilliant industrial design team at SpaceX that got the vision just like I did, and to have that as a partnership was brilliant. That's why when you look at Commercial Crew, which was when we brought humans back to space, back in, I think it was 2021, it was such a collaboration of industrial design, broadcast design, branding, all of those kind of things coming together in unison as like a symphony of what the future of space should look like and feel like. But you're right. I mean, with SpaceX, you're talking about really cool, sexy rockets and fire and pizzazz, and when you're starting to think about long-term living, it's not just about that boom moment. It's not just about, 3 days and you've got your little orbit around the moon and come down. I mean, we're talking about sustaining life. And that's everything, right? That's you talking to your kids and living and developing a community up there. And in some of the simulations that I'd been in with NASA Goddard, like the one on top of the volcano in Hawaii, we were there for a month, and you start to realize how important it is to just come together every evening and have a meal together. And it's these kind of things that you take for granted when you're in your daily life and you're going to the bodega in New York.
Could you tell that to my kids, by the way? Because they don't believe, sitting around the table, it's not for them. So
Yeah, well, but it's like we always revert to these primal things. And it's what's so fascinating about this industry and designing for it. I mean, talking to some of the astronauts, they're like, I just miss what my butt feels like sitting in a seat. And you're just sitting there going, oh my God, I never thought of that. Like they miss being cradled by something like this chair right now. And I'm actually, it's like how a child thinks, right? It's like they're fascinated by how this seat feels on their butt, like how I'm actually feeling in my seat right now, this beautiful velour thingy. That's comforting to me in a way that is totally subconscious. It's something I take for granted. When you're in space, they're asking to be cradled, like when they sleep, being attached to a wall like a little burrito. I'm like, so I'm making space burritos, is what you're saying, sir. So this is the kind of fun stuff where you get to think almost with childlike eyes because you're seeing how is the day in the life of, as a human, work? And we don't recognize, unless you've been hospitalized for a period of time, and I hope nobody here has, what happens to your muscles. We take for granted how walking down the street, what that does for us from a physiological standpoint. And when you're in zero gravity, you don't have those opportunities. So you've got to be working out. You have to like directly focus yourself on how are you actually creating that muscle tension. And so on the ISS, they have a really rudimentary treadmill, and it all looks like the inside of a VCR. It's like designer's nightmare. But like, what happens when you actually think through that and you say, okay, what is the optimized living? And then also, we're thinking a lot, or at least selfishly at VAST, thinking about, accessibility too. What happens if we can actually create solutions for people who have certain types of muscle dystrophy or paralyzation? I mean, right now, it's physical therapy in a pool. Well, what happens when you're in zero gravity? I mean, think of all of those things. And to be able to design for that, those kind of solutions is what gets me up every day. I'm so excited.
Let's talk a little bit about language. And I spent the first chunk of my career as a design engineer, so I was sort of sitting at this nexus between design and engineering. I was never a great engineer, struggled through calculus and all that stuff. But,
Same.
But I did kind of learn some of the language of engineers and engineering, and I think that helped in my design career. And you're kind of sitting at this nexus as well. So talk to us a little bit about that divide between, if you want to say design and engineering or creative and engineering language and how you approach it.
It's the same in tech too. God, I'm reading the Johnny Ive book, and I'm just finding so many parallels. Back in the Apple days when PC and everything was about corporate computers, and they're like, hang on, what if we made it for the individual and we actually paid attention to human experience? And there's this thing where we speak different languages. Engineers, even from college, like you're going through 4 years of school to learn a specific language. And when I was working in advertising, where creative is king and everything, developers, everything ladders up to the creative, right? And then going from there to Google was a real interesting transition. I loved being in the space where, they were bringing in creatives to take, this was right after Google Glass, right? Where they had this brilliant, Google Glass is such a brilliant product. But they didn't connect it to the human use case. Like, what is this actually going to solve for? And, it's like if we were in there and able to say like, hey, let's start off with like people that use their hands a lot, like UPS drivers. If Google Glass just started off with that, where it was just that particular use case that solves a real problem, we might have been in a different place. But to be able to get down there and say, I see what you guys as engineers are doing. I'm sitting here from a storytelling perspective, from a human standpoint and a human experience standpoint, and saying, we're both kind of solving for the same problem, but doing it from different positions. And I want to hear how your thinking is. And that's really the same thing that's happening in aerospace, where even more so, there's so many different certifications and restrictions. I mean, you're in a pure oxygen environment. Everything's flammable. How are you going with those restrictions and being able to work with the engineer to say, I'm not trying to screw up your day here. We are doing the same thing. Everything we're doing is for the sake of this person that is going to be living long-term in space and not having horrible medical problems, and the very most having the time of an experience of their life. It's coming to the realization that when you're in an engineering world, when you're in tech, when you're in aerospace, it is our job to understand that language and to earn the trust in both ways. Going in, even Starlink, when we started at Starlink, we used SpaceX engineers, right, to create this brilliant platform. And I had customer experience, right, from consumer products. And that didn't mean that suddenly I was running the show. It really meant that we had conversations about, like, we use my mom, my wonderful mother who lives in Indiana in a very small town. We're like, if my mother cannot put this thing on her roof and turn it on and plug it in, we're screwed. We're done. So like my mom is on all of these patents. but it's like coming to there and understanding what their motivations are and me listening and them listening and creating that center of trust. That's where you get that really good friction. I love my ops team. I love Molly, who I actually worked with at SpaceX, and I work with her at Vast. She's the one who's kind of responsible for pushing back on, this is how we keep people alive. This is how we keep them safe. She knows all of that fun, science-y stuff. And I'm sitting here learning all the science-y stuff so I can work with her to create something that is truly safe and not going to cause any problems, but also create a better time for these astronauts. Every single person, whether you work in tech or you work in aerospace, you're always going to have people that are not coming from the same place as you. But I really wish that you would take the time, take them out to lunch, throw the first card on the table and say, I just want to know more about what you do. Because I'm telling you, it's how you get to the best product in these places.
We'll return to the conversation after this quick break. This message is sponsored by Greenlight. One of the greatest gifts that my parents gave me is the basics of financial literacy. And now, as a parent to a 14 and a 10-year-old, I want to pass on that same literacy so my kids are set up for success in life. So years ago, I set up our boys with Greenlight, a debit card and money app made for families. Their allowance is automatically deposited into their account Friday evenings, and it's divided into 3 buckets: spending, saving, and giving. With Greenlight's investing tools, I've helped my kids learn how to invest in stocks and mutual funds, and they've been able to watch those investments grow. This past January, my boys each made charitable contributions of their own money in sizable amounts to nonprofits doing work that they believe in. And that was only possible because Greenlight automatically sets aside money from their allowance. They're so proud of what they did. And I got to say, so am I. I talk to my kids about money all the time, but the lessons that hit home the most are the ones that come from the real world. They're able to be independent with a debit card and track their money in the Greenlight app. Before you know it, your kids are going to be leaving home to build a life. Do they have the financial literacy that they need for success? Greenlight can help you prepare them. Sign up for Greenlight today and get your first month free when you go to greenlight.com/designbetter. That's greenlight.com/designbetter to try Greenlight for free. Greenlight.com/designbetter. Design Better is sponsored by BetterHelp. For many of us, the biggest source of stress in our lives is our work. Politics, organizational change, the demands of the job all add up. And before you know it, you can find yourself burned out and emotionally exhausted. Sound familiar? You can't do your best work if you're not at your best. Therapy is an effective way to work through it all and develop positive mental health. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online and designed to be convenient, flexible, and to work with your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire online to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. BetterHelp can help you get the support that you need. Visit betterhelp.com/designbetter to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/designbetter. And now, back to the show. Traditionally, or historically, the aerospace industry has been dominated by a lot of men. When we go see these stories of like the 1960s and launching astronauts into space, it's definitely a one-sided story. You bring a lot of perspective and skills to the table. Could you talk to us about the friction that you felt as a woman in the aerospace industry and how you've approached it?
A lot of these industries that I've been in, whether it's, it started off in drag racing, right? One of my favorite things was not giving my name out or giving a fake name, and then you take your helmet off, after you beat the pants off some dude and sorry, buddy. What I've really enjoyed about it is, like in advertising, we didn't have the Mad Men you saw on the TV show, but you still had this culture where people were primal creatures and we gravitate towards people that we understand and we connect with. And it's always been this macho, I want to swear and tell sex jokes and, and then Hilary walks in the room and it's like, ah. And, as a female in that industry, you kind of have these two options where you either dive in and, have a dirty mouth and, laugh at the jokes and go to the bars, or you find yourself in a separate space. And what I really appreciated at my time in advertising was you started to get these women who are really, really good at the craft. And I think a lot of us women were working later. It's not to say that men aren't also working their butts off, but man, you saw a lot of these women to prove that you deserve to be at the table just the same. And I found in aerospace, there's this idea that you have to push and shove your way through if you're a woman. There's only one spot there. And what I really learned, Linda Knight was one of my mentors in advertising. She used to work at Wieden and Kennedy on Nike and stuff. And she really gave me that, leaning back in the chair with the Louboutin heels on, smoking a proverbial cigarette kind of thing where, it's cool, Hilary, it's cool. Like, you got this, you're fine. And I always like to, find those archetypes to kind of base my emotional status off of. And I just found myself cozying up to some of these women going, hey, look at you, you're here too, and I'm here too. And you start to create these tribes, I like to call them, of like these women that are just, we're cool in the room, we're holding our space. It's like we're cosplaying until we are a seat at the table. And I don't know if that totally makes sense unless you've been in it, but it's like every company, when I went to SpaceX, I found those women and I was just like, hey girl, like I see you're doing something cool over here. Like you're a mechanical engineer. Tell me about that. And starting to advocate for them. And I don't mean, advocating for them just at work, but having that space and we created a women's club at SpaceX, and I'm hoping to pursue that also at Vast of like, let's create open spaces where we can find our tribe and find a safe space, because there are certain things that we are going to be going through that men just aren't going to. And I think the more we can talk about it and find that common ground, there's a lot of us ex-SpaceXers that actually have a group where, we text each other all the time and actually have an open space to ask these questions. Like, I don't understand how this works. And you don't want to be the woman in the room who doesn't know the thing. And going from there and getting that baseline and then having the confidence to ask that same question in the room with everyone, to be able to say with confidence, hey, I don't know what that means. Can you tell me what that acronym is, which, God, aerospace is just chock full of them, but once you can get to that point where you are calm, you're collected, you got your Louboutins on, you're leaned back in the chair, and you can consciously say, like, I don't know, but I'm curious and I want to find out. And I've actually found more respect from my male colleagues by having that foundation and that sentiment, because it shows that I'm not faking something. I'm actually curious and willing to learn, and coming back to the table, knowing exactly how to phase to the ISS and having a whole diagram drawn out. And they're like, oh, wait, she did her homework. Like, she's one of us. It's one of those things that started with having my tribe of women as a foundation.
I want to rewind for a second back to the hopefully not too embarrassing intro that we did. And I actually cribbed a little bit of it from your LinkedIn bio. And you said that you want to be an advocate for young women and men entering STEM fields. And I was kind of touched by that because I have a daughter and a son. And I think it's awesome that someone like you is inspiring my daughter to enter a field. But I also think, like, it's great that you're inspiring my son. Like, why can't he look up to a woman and say, wow, I want to be like her. I want to be a drag racer, an astronaut, astronaut candidate. I want to design things for space. So was that intentional?
I mean, absolutely intentional. When there's friction at a place, you want to push up against that. And definitely women being able to see themselves it's someone who looks like them, is a girl like them. During Commercial Crew, my friend Lauren Lyons, who is one of my female tribesmen, she's the Black woman who was on the webcast, and she got all of these messages from young Black girls who were saying, like, my daughter is now obsessed with space. She wants to be an astronaut because she saw Lauren there. And it's like, yes, this can be for everyone. But I think when you talk about everyone, you also need to talk about everyone. And, we just did this STEM festival with the Department of Education. Carrie Bryan, if any of you guys have watched Mythbusters as children, I love her. She's a friend of mine. And she just did this huge STEM festival up in DC. And I'm telling you, these kids, they have the most brilliant minds when they have the resources. And I just think that if we're going to set an example that young girls and young boys need heroes, and they need to see women as much as men, because I think that's where true equality comes from. I don't only want to be speaking to women. I want to be speaking to both, because as you know, as a father, it's like you're setting examples either way. I think it's equally as important. And by the way, if they want to talk to me about space, I'm happy to.
Oh, they would love it.
That's great. Fantastic. Tell us about your interview at SpaceX. What was that like?
It's just one of those things where, like, you read any of these self-help books, right? And, talking about imposter syndrome, and oh my gosh, I am not free of imposter syndrome. I just have this, I don't know if it's a masochistic tendency to just drive towards things that are hard and seem impossible and scary. But yeah, like going, as someone who came up in advertising and went to film school and did some time at Apple and Google, what business do I have in aerospace? Like, honestly, what business? But as a fan and understanding that they were going to be going after human space flight, I just couldn't get it out of my head. I was like, I've been trained in, interaction design, product design, advertising. I love telling stories, and they're not doing the greatest job of it. It's like as a designer and you've got a truck in front of you in traffic and the kerning's off on their logo and you're like, oh my God, this is horrible. It's like the same thing where I'm just like, there's so much opportunity that can come from this. And I couldn't, it's like the voice in my head and that bunny rabbit just kept going, come this way. So yeah, I got up the guts. I bugged, enough of my friends, and Peter Diamandis at X Prize, who is a dear friend and mentor, he's like, all right, I'm going to listen. You can't let me down. But we're going to get you in there. And so, I find myself in front of a seat with Gwen, who's just this powerhouse and the unspoken, lord of SpaceX. I had to sit down in front of Elon as well, which is a bit intimidating. The morning before, you're kind of sitting there going, I can't, what am I doing? What am I doing here? But I think, to have that creative conviction, and I just hope that every creative gives themselves permission to have that conviction if they truly feel like they have a problem that they can solve. And that's exactly what got me into my car reluctantly and driving down to that office and putting myself in front of, who was going to become one of the more powerful figures. And to be able to tell him everything that was wrong with his company that I was uniquely qualified to solve. And, and he's like, all right, fine, you got 3 months, you're fired. But I think what that taught me is, oh my gosh, you bet on yourself and you give yourself permission to be anywhere as long as you have that creative conviction that you too can basically land your dream job and be designing for astronauts.
So we want to open up to questions from the audience, I think, right now.
Yeah.
We don't get a chance to do this at home. I mean, unless we bring our dog or one of our kids down. So
Our dogs are pretty much in the room every episode we record, but not visible. Daniel's going to pass out the microphone here, but if you have a question for Hilary, the floor is open.
I guess one question I have in terms of, you brought up storytelling a lot, and I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on what kind of stories you're trying to tell in terms of living in space.
And it's funny because I've worked with several agencies before thinking, my people, we could just bring this problem to a standard ad agency and they can solve this problem with me. And it ends up becoming a story of, it's the same sci-fi tale of, space being cool. And yes, it's cool, but what happens when it's actually attainable? What happens when we get past I feel like science fiction writers have already written that story. What happens when we make it real? What happens when it's not a dystopian nightmare and it's actually something that is attainable and that is for all of us? And I think it's really fascinating that we had this really bold story in the 60s as part of the, Cold War against Russia, where it's like, we have these heroes, we must go to space, one step for all mankind, and these like glowing, unattainable creatures. And by the way, Victor Glover is my favorite astronaut, and I meet him, and he is that guy. Like, I'm like, is something wrong with you? Like, you've been to, like, he's a Harvard grad and a military, and I'm like, Anyway, I digress. But I think the story to be told now, it feels to me like it should be less about the astronaut as hero, but about the democratization of space. And now that we've opened it up to it's not easy, but we've got autonomous space vehicles. We're creating private space stations. So we're kind of opening the framework for science and research and human exploration to be that much more attainable. And hopefully in our lifetime, be affordable. So if that becomes the new horizon for space, what now is the story? What now is the narrative for space? It's not about it's the hard thing that only the heroes can do, but how does that solve for Earth and solve for the future of human exploration? And that's the fun part that I don't think we've really solved yet, because I think it's just begun. But it's what I challenge any new space company or private space agency to come up with, is what is that story when it's not about just the superhero or some dystopian sci-fi, but what is that story when it is for all of us? And I think that, to me, is a really interesting playground for the narration of space. And it's something that I really want to push towards in my career with VAST, is how do you solve for the human experience? And what is that story you're telling if it truly becomes something that all of us can have access to?
Got a question in the back here.
Hey, hello. Thanks for your amazing story. And when you were talking about the space and what can be bring to the Earth, I was thinking about the well-being stuff, and this is remote world that's coming already here. And I started thinking that the space always was like this. People there were alone. They were talking with the Earth like remotely and have different problems that we can solve right now, like on the screen, just talking with a person. The question will be, do you think that something that were already created for the space could be bring to our, everyday routine life and help us to be more organized with well-being or more closer to the people in the remote working space?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. And I mean, I often compare it a little bit. We all just went through a global pandemic, and we were all stuck in our little spaceships. And I call it that because we couldn't visit our family. We couldn't just, go down the street to the local market and say hi to the guy at the cash register we do every morning. A lot of those things were taken from us, right? Those little things that seem so small suddenly became very big. And I think that affected us psychologically speaking. We all kind of felt a bit uprooted, even though we were still just in our same homes. And I think that's something that's really interesting to find when we do these simulations, when we talk to these astronauts. I mean, some of them have been up there for over a year. And I don't think a lot of people know that on the International Space Station, that people have been in space for that long. And what you hear is very much that conversation around needing human connection, real human connection. And I think whereas I might be talking to an audience 5 years ago that might not have understood what that means, I think since all of us have lived through the pandemic, it becomes a lot more real, right? It's this simple need. It's a human primal need for connection. We are not meant to be solo through a computer screen. It's very isolating. And I think that living in space is another petri dish for that. And it's like I was talking about earlier, being able to, in our simulations, being able to come together at a table or whatever you would have as your similar item in space, but coming together as a group and sharing stories, telling stories, and having that connection, those intimate bonds with people, especially in space, because my friend Simon Sinek talks about it with the military, where, when you can create trust with each other and you can create that intimate connection. Originally, people think that's fluffy stuff. You don't talk about that in the military. But it's the same in space. It's like being able to get to know your neighbor on an intimate level, because if something becomes an issue and you guys need to work together, you have to have that bond. And I think what we've realized is in space, being able to have your personal space when you need it, right? Because you need that time to unwind. You need that quiet time. I'm an introvert, and before I always go and talk to these beautiful people, I want to sit in a room by myself. The human condition is very fascinating, and that's exactly what we're designing for. It's not necessarily for what we're used to, but it's understanding those primal needs that if they're taken away, that can add up. And suddenly your performance is off. Suddenly you're not having a great time, which when you're multiplying that by many years, which we're hoping to create in space, what are those things? We need to touch grass. So are we putting grass on space stations? All these kind of things. Being able to connect to each other, though, is a huge one.
Hi, my name is Philip. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us. Two-pronged question. Number one, how far is humanity away from living in outer space, be it on a planet or a hotel or some sort of, floating Star Trek type body? And what other things would you like to see for us to develop for you to feel comfortable living in space for, 5, 10 years, something like that? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. The first one might be more of a SpaceX question because, I think step one is to actually get there and get humans there and get supplies there. And, I think with Starship being well on its way to going orbital, I would say, within this year, once it can go orbital, that's when you can start to find yourself orbiting Mars, orbiting the moon, and then actually landing on Mars. I mean, if we're going to be living in outer space, AKA outside of low Earth orbit, there's a lot of hard things, but you've got NASA Artemis program that's happening right now. They already did one launch. They're going to be doing another launch coming up in a few years. So I could easily say that you're going to start seeing long-term presence perhaps on the moon, or at least orbiting the moon within the next 10 years. You're going to see in the next couple decades some really interesting things happening, especially with companies like SpaceX creating Starship vehicles that could actually take us there. Because that's been the hardest thing thus far, is how do you get there and land safely? Your second question about what would it take for me to feel comfortable living out for long periods of time? One of the things that is really interesting that VAST is doing is going after artificial gravity. If you guys are bored enough to watch some of those documentaries on what the astronauts go through when they're up there for a year, there's a lot of physiological things that happen to the human body because we require gravity. We've evolved our human bodies over many a year to respond to gravity. And when you don't have gravity for lengths of time, there's things like pressure behind the ears. I mean, your entire DNA can change. And I think for me to personally feel comfortable orbiting Europa or one of those distant planets for a long period of time, I would want to have some form of artificial gravity, because I don't feel like we're going to be able to mitigate that kind of physiological problem without artificial gravity, which is something that we are going after. The other thing is just, like everything I've been talking about, right? Making it feel comfortable, making it feel like home, making it feel like I'm not just in a tin can millions of miles away from my friends and family and trees and, all the things that we appreciate as human beings that we don't realize we need until we're gone.
Hi, Hilary. Thank you so much, first off. I mean, what an illustrious career. So thank you. My name is Shani, and I'm curious about, given the role of designers in areas that are emergent, very consequential like yours, what do you think with these greater responsibilities are now the responsibilities of designers?
when it comes to design and these, like you say, these emerging industries, I can speak for aerospace in saying that if we were just exploration with robots on other planets, that would be one thing. I feel like it is my responsibility as a designer in aerospace to speak for humanity and to also speak for the human. I feel like I, in a way, represent all of us when I am designing for something that is so symbolically one of humanity's greatest missions. Obviously, I think it's to be kinder to this planet and to each other, but I also think the idea of exploration is ingrained in us since the beginning of time. And I think that we take a great responsibility for that. But then using it as powers of 10 down to the individual, I think it is my responsibility to speak for every astronaut, every person who's going to, grow up, your son and daughter that are going to grow up to be astronauts.
My son actually wants to be a zookeeper and a professional soccer player right now, but he might change his mind.
He could be a zookeeper in space.
That's true.
I'm just saying,
Yeah,
we don't have to limit this to humans.
Space soccer.
Space soccer.
That would be interesting, actually. But yeah, I hold that responsibility to creating an environment and a life where his daughter then, who may become the astronaut, is going to be able to do their best work, is going to be able to live that dream that they would want on a different planet. And if she's a researcher and wants to be studying the space squid on Europa that we find, I want to make sure that she has all the tools and everything necessary for her to be able to do her best work there. And I think that starts with the fundamentals. That starts with her environment, what tools are given to her. And I think it's the designer's responsibility to create that space that she's going to do her best work in. I mean, that's how I see it, just as an interior designer, industrial designer would with a product. Except you've got the added weight of this is kind of one of humanity's greatest adventures that you're designing for. But I take that very seriously. And it is not just the Air Force pilot that I have in mind. It's the person who is handicapped and now able to do in space what they couldn't do on Earth. It's for any kind of person. And hopefully anyone would be able to afford this in my lifetime, if not shortly thereafter. But what we do here is what is taking it out of sci-fi, right? We're taking it out of sci-fi and making this real, and it shouldn't have to just be what we've seen in the movies. And it needs to feel attainable and accessible to all of us. So those are what I consider to be my responsibilities.
We have time for one last question.
You sort of answered my question a little bit before, but it's two-part. First of all, you had to convince them to make this transition from what you had worked on previously to moving to SpaceX, to moving to your current endeavor. But how, at some point, did you consider the weight behind, the responsibility behind taking on these designs? If you're working in advertising, there's some sort of responsibility, but not to the extent that there is in this. So at some point, do you feel some sort of huge responsibility when you are designing for these spaces and people?
Now that you say it that way.
Sorry. But that's great. Wouldn't that be? It's great, the responsibility.
I'm just having an existential crisis on stage. No, and honestly, I would have to say that I was just chasing that childlike, creative, this sucks and I want to make this better. I had no idea about the gravity because I didn't know if it was even going to work. I mean, I was just under the assumption that I'm just going to shoot my shot and we're just going to see. And in advertising, we've felt that before, where you get that one client that kind of aligns with your personal beliefs a bit, or it's, I remember we were doing it for like Best Friends Animal Society, and Lee Clow was the head of it. And I'm like, I get to work with my hero. I get to do stuff for animals. And, you start to get that spark and you start to feel a little bit of the gravity, right? That you're doing something more than just selling soda water to someone. And no, I think to me, it was just like, what happens if instead of just following what's next in front of me, I actually take a second and say, what is sparking my eyes right now? What is that fire If I think about something and you just start to feel that energy, those electrons clicking against each other and following that rabbit down the rabbit hole. I don't know that Alice in Wonderland realized what kind of gravity she was getting into, and she just went down that rabbit hole. And I would have to say it was kind of the same for me. It was an experiment of what happens where instead of just chasing my next resume piece that felt right, I was actually going after what that child inside of me was saying, hey, over here, come down this. Let's see what this is. It's the only way I know how to explain it. And it wasn't until, sitting down with the astronauts for Commercial Crew that I think it really started to hit me that this wasn't something we were just doing as a team in a vacuum, that we were actually creating the future of what aerospace and human spaceflight in the 21st century was going to be. And then, of course, seeing them launch, it was just, I still tear up thinking about being able to be part of something bigger than myself in so many ways. It's quite rewarding, and I hope every creative listening gets to feel that at some point.
Well, that's a pretty darn good place to end it.
Thanks, Hilary, for being on Design Better.
Thank you. Thank you.
See you guys.
This episode was produced by Eli Woolery and me, Aaron Walter, with engineering and production support from Brian Paik of Pacific Audio. If you found this episode useful, we hope that you'll leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to finer shows. Or simply drop a link to the show in your team's Slack channel, designbetterpodcast.com. It'll really help others discover the show. Until next time.